Thank you. Thank you so much. It's really a wonderful opportunity to come talk to you today about work that actually started during my time in Karlsruhe. I worked with Jörg Weissmuller on nanoporous gold during my Humboldt Fellowship, and I guess luckily we lured him up from Karlsruhe up to Hamburg, both at the Helmholtz Center as well as at TUHH, and thanks to the SFB 986, we've been working again together on this material for the past 4 years and going into the second Förderphase. So I definitely want to acknowledge the many collaborators who have been involved in this work. I sort of think that I'm here presenting work definitely of others. Towards the end, I'll focus a little bit more on my interests. I always tell people I don't make materials. I work with people who make beautiful materials, and that is definitely Jörg Weissmuller and his colleagues. In particular, Kai-Shang Hu is the PhD student who actually carried out most of the experiments that I'll be showing, and it's very beautiful, detailed work, so I want to specifically say something to him. Architecture, yeah, and we know that and let me back up here. We look about exploring microstructural length scales, yeah, for looking at new materials, and that's the focus of the talk. Exploring multiple length scales is nothing new, and we think about it in terms of architecture. A wonderful example, of course, the Eiffel Tower. And if we zoom in, we can see that there's all sorts of multiple length scales that are involved. And we can see here just the sort of length scales that we're talking about, from 1 meter, I think this gave up the ghost, down to meters. What's interesting, though, is that this is functional, perhaps structural reliability, but also beauty we can think about in terms of function. More recently, this idea of architected materials has come to be, and a bit of a nod from, again, work coming from Karlsruhe. I'm showing here, these are, I believe, the smallest length scale nanoscribe-based architected materials. This is an example of glassy carbon that's been recently published in Nature Materials, where we can really reduce these length scales. It otherwise sort of looks similar to the Eiffel Tower structures and these stresses. But we can also go a little bit to a smaller length scale, taking a very different approach in developing the material. Rather than building up these lattice structures from individual ligaments, we can look at this example on the right, nanoporous gold, where we're looking at ligament sizes on the order of tens of nanometers. And this is basically a top-down approach, and I'll explain a little bit about what this material is. Showing here, as I said, this is work from others, really sort of introduced in the early 90s from Karl Saradsky and colleagues. And it was recognized that by using a alloy, solid solution alloy between silver and gold, that one, through appropriate electrochemical processing, you can actually get the silver, the slightly less noble species, to leach out. And when it does, it leaves behind very similar sized. If someone could please try and get me a working, here we go. So this is after the de-alloying process. The shape is basically the same, the dimensions are the same, but if we looked deep inside into this material, we would see that it's this bicontinuous network structure. It's porous. And the porosity is about 70%, so we do still have a little bit left over of the silver in here, but it's namely single crystal, or at least maintaining the grain structure, gold with this open pore ligament structure. And this just gives a sort of schematic step-by-step of the electrochemical dissolution process, atomistic film from the Saradsky group. So why is this so interesting? Yeah, we're not going to build buildings from gold, although I do have a little bit of a punchline at the end where we might think about gold-plated airplanes. It's nice because of the high surface area, and one can think there's a lot of different reasons by maximizing surface to volume ratios that we can get new functionality out of materials. And one that we want to think about in terms of gold is the impact of the surface stress that we can then sort of play around with either potentials to introduce displacements or strains. In that sense, we'd be working as an actuation device. Or we can think about playing around with straining the material and picking up a sense, as a signal, that then we can actually use this for various types of sensing applications. So this is the heart of it. High surface area, and we can get some additional functionality out of that, actuation and sensing being two that we want to think about today. But of course, as soon as we're talking about this displacement or that the strains are involved, of course, the mechanical behavior of this material becomes important. If not principal, anything that's going to function over a long time needs to be mechanically stable. And that's where my interest comes in, really understanding the mechanical behavior. Let me give you one quick example. This is some work, again, recently published by collaborators of Jörg Weissmuller, where we're actually seeing this actuation here, blown up here, where we can see applying a potential, cyclic potential, we can actually get this to nicely reversibly displace. So we have the actuation here that we can see, and one can keep in mind this bending deformation, because we will look at an experiment of bending of nanoporous gold a little bit later. So what's interesting, when we think about playing around with length scales, we can actually tailor the properties of this material by playing around with their intrinsic length scales. Here is the example of the material right after dealloying, but we can coarsen it to actually thicken up the structure. We can think about other ideas, such as introducing a second phase, in this case, coating it with a polymer that might hopefully in the future serve as a solid electrolyte, so we can get all this sensing and actuation capability without working in liquid. And very recently from the Weissmuller group, where they've been able to actually introduce hierarchy in the porous structure, so that you've got this structure that we've seen before, coarsened, and through selective dealloying and coarsening, you can actually get this porosity down to another length scale. So why is it important that we're playing around with length scale? Of course, surface to area ratios or surface area to volume ratios will be influenced by the length scales involved. But most importantly, and this is where my work comes in, that we can look at the mechanical behavior as a function of length scale. And this wide observation that smaller is stronger has been shown in a variety of types of experiments, and a lot of focus on gold, where one can think about bulk gold, small finite volumes, increasing the yield strength just by reducing the dimensions. This is a whole set of data from different groups working on nanoporous gold, where we can vary the dimension of the ligament, and also as comparison, ideal sort of nanowires of gold pulled in tension. So smaller is stronger, and that's something that we can exploit to improve the mechanical response of these materials. But interestingly, with nanoporous gold, it's not just the strength that ends up introducing some different types of mechanical, or it's not just the strength that has a slightly different mechanical response, but also the modulus. So we're talking about porous materials, and conventional wisdom from Gibson and Ashby tells us the mechanical properties, in particular the stiffness of the material, the elastic modulus, scales as the relative density squared. Yeah, and that's this curve that we see here in red. But it's been shown, while that works for lots of these sort of conventional macroscopic foams, where this is this Gibson-Ashby envisioned structure, it looks sort of similar. It's this nice lattice structure, well connected. But when we look at the various works in nanoporous gold, we have strong deviations from this trend. And one might think, well, when we look at this structure, at least with our eye, or with the electron microscope, it doesn't look very much like this well-periodic truss structure. And therefore, the importance of trying to understand some of these length scale dependent mechanical responses comes back to what the structure is, the very classic material science approach, structure and properties. And so that's why we go in and we try and understand the structure of this material at the smallest length scales. There's nothing particularly new about tomography, trying to get three-dimensional visualizations of microstructure. What's a little bit unique in this case, we're looking at a series of two-dimensional slices that have been fabricated with a focused ion beam through a nanoporous gold. It was infiltrated with epoxy to get nice clean cross-sections. And then we've got the reconstruction of these slices. What's interesting is that the slice thickness here is on the order of 5 to 10 nanometers at the smallest length scale structures, and that we've been able to do this reproducibly and to limit any sort of artifacts. So once we get this three-dimensional structure, we can look at various metric and topological properties, and that's what I'm going to talk about right now. So interestingly, we've taken a look at a couple different coarsened structures, and here are two of the three-dimensional reconstructions from those. Now, I guess at just looking at it with your eye, you would say that these look very, very similar, and so perhaps it's the same sample or otherwise just a different region. And if we now bring in the length scales associated with these volumes, we see that here we're looking at a 400 nanometer cubed volume here for the as-dealloyed structure, where we've been able to quantify the mean ligament diameter about 26 nanometers, and here one of the more coarsened structures with the mean ligament diameter 20 times as much. We can see that here we get this very self-similar type of appearance, that we have self-similar coarsening. This becomes very important if we're going to try and develop any sort of scaling rules or models relating the mechanical behavior to structural. We have to understand that we can tailor the length scales here and use a single approach to understand the mechanical response. So self-similarity was a key finding here that had been debated for about 20 years. Further, we can see that we can quantify not only the mean ligament diameters, but the ligament distributions. Again, thinking about mechanics, trying to worry about whether or not we're dealing with extreme value behaviors or mean values. The distributions of length scales also becomes important, and this is achieved with this type of tomographic as an exploration. But I still have not answered the question why we necessarily need to go to 3D, right? So a lot of these length scales and relative densities can be done from a stereological 2D approach. But I would say that as soon as we start thinking about the topology, and specifically the connectivity, we need to look at 3D. And one can imagine that from this two-dimensional structure, if I shook it, all of these little cross-sections of ligaments would shake out. And in this case, I actually had my 3D printout here, sorry. If I shake this, then the whole thing sticks together. And so if we're thinking about mechanics, we know the connectivity is strongly governing the mechanical response in some way. So connectivity ends up being a very important structural parameter that we try and look at. So I'm going to dumb it down a little bit. Hopefully we can get through this in 1 minute, what we mean by connectivity, because it's very important. You can think about your quark ball or your Brezel or American donut, being from America. And the connectivity then is defined by the number of cuts that we can make through these structures before it breaks off into two pieces. And so, of course, for the quark ball here, we have zero connectivity. A single cut is going to break it apart. A donut, I can get a single cut in there before it goes, and with the Brezel, 3. So now we've defined what connectivity is. As soon as we start applying it to these three-dimensional structures, we start needing to think about in terms of density. So how many cuts per unit volume? So again, very simple. If we had the same size box, a meter cubed, here I've got now my different connectivity densities. But of course, when we start thinking about the coarsening of our structure, and we want to think about the connectivity density as a representative of that type of structure, we're going to have to scale it in some way. And therefore, even though the density here, the connectivity density for the fine structured material is going to be much higher than for a single donut in a huge volume, if we scale it by the average ligament diameter cubed, we can find out that indeed the scaled connectivity density for a self-similar structure ends up being uniform. Okay, so I'm going to use this concept to further show evidence that we have a relatively self-similar structure. Again, looking at the difference between the as-dealloyed to the fully coarsened structure. We've got 5 different samples that we've analyzed through different isothermal heat treatments. And I would argue that the normalized conductivity is nominally constant at about 0.1. Okay, and so it shows we've got this nice self-similar coarsening. But how am I going to relate this now back to the mechanics? Right? So what's important is that we can try and figure out how these length scales influence the mechanical response. In particular, we're thinking about stiffness here. There's a lot more difficulties when we start extending this to strengths and plastic deformations. We're focused here just on stiffness. Again, we've got this idea from Gibson and Ashby that if I take my total solid volume fraction, that's all I need to be able to predict what the stiffness is. And if I apply that perhaps to this nice glassy carbon lattice structure, I would expect that it probably does a pretty good job of doing that, because we can see that this is a very nicely interconnected structure similar to the simple view that we've had. Now, I can imagine that if I start reducing the connectivity by having sort of floating ligaments that aren't interconnected, which we see here with this nanoporous gold structure, we're reducing the connectivity, but we're still maintaining the volume fraction. And so rather than thinking about the total volume fraction in Gibson-Ashby, we might want to start thinking about the load-bearing volume, which relates directly to the connectivity density and not the volume fraction. So that's sort of the approach that we have, and that would tell me that not only do I have this ligament diameter, which I might need to invoke in any sort of mechanical description, but there's this ring dimension, yeah? This concept which is not the pore size, it's not the ligament diameter, it relates to the connectivity. And so the question is, can we get at that structure, either directly from 3D reconstructions or in some other way? I'm going to argue when we build up this structure, rather than thinking of it as the ideal lattice from Gibson and Ashby, we can think about it as these interconnected tori. And this is a cutout from one of our 3D reconstructions, and this is a simulated torus of sort of random varying diameter. So we're going to take this sort of picture and think about how we can analyze the length scales associated with these tori, and doing that, we'd use the curvatures. I don't want to go into detail here, but with a simple donut, we can see that the curvature, one of the mean principal curvatures, is always going to tell me that I have the inverse of the ligament diameter over 2. And this one here, from the outer side, the ring loop, right, is going to relate to the other mean principal curvature, and it's going to tend a little bit towards a negative value. So when we analyze the mean principal curvatures of our nanoporous gold, big volumes of this, we actually get this amazing scaling response between the two principal curvatures, which we can then directly relate to these structural length scales. And it comes out beautifully that indeed this inverse as a curvature is in fact the radius of the ligaments, and this other one is significantly larger. And now the question is, does this ring size actually influence the mechanical response? So I know I'm wiping a lot of details here about this experiment under the rug. Please bear with me. This is a microcantilever beam. It's actually a triangular beam. It's an important detail that we get constant strain at the top and at the bottom. So it's in tension and compression underneath. And what you'll see is that we've got these little hot spots. And if I can find the appropriate time to do a quick pause, we've got these hot spots, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And if we think about the spacings of those hot spots, it comes out very nicely with this predicted ring size that comes out of our curvature analysis. Okay, so that's telling us that yes, indeed, we're getting this strain localization associated with this ring structure. And so we could still maybe take this Gibson-Ashby approach. And this is a schematic of how they understand how the bending of these structures actually goes, but it's not the pore size, it's this other structural length scale that we also can play around with. So as a last sort of fleeting slide here, coming from Geestach, I need to show a picture of an airplane. Of course, we're involved in lightweight structural materials, so the question is gold, nanoporous gold, how does that fit in with our Helmholtz program? Sort of pie in the sky look at this is that we talked about being able to use this material for sensing applications. And of course, structural health, reliability of airplane structures is a very important and topical area of research. And the idea would be, perhaps not with gold, perhaps not a gold-plated airplane, but other types of materials that one can also play around with the porosity in individualizing what the structural length scales are that influence modulus, that we can start adapting to different types of mechanical properties to influence either strain sensing or actuation in other cases. So with that, I thank you for your attention and be happy to answer questions.